This is a 1994 Mercedes-Benz E60 AMG, and it's a truly special car. Back in the days before Mercedes-Benz owned AMG, AMG did their own thing, tuning and upgrading Mercedes-Benz models for more power and a revised look. Pre-merger AMG models, that's what they're called, are tremendously rare, and this is one of them. And today I'm going to show you all the quirks and features of this E60. Before I get started, big news, this E60 AMG is currently for sale, being offered by the Cultivated Collector on Cars and Bids. This is a real E60 AMG with the coveted 957 VIN code and a big 6-liter V8 engine. These pre-merger AMG cars are all the rage right now. Their values are shooting through the roof, and you can get this one on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this E60 AMG, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the E60 AMG with a little overview of exactly what this car is, starting with the Mercedes-Benz component. This is a W124 E-Class. Those were made from 86 to 95, but more importantly, this is a 500E. That was the most special version of the W124. It was only sold from 92 to 95, and it had the biggest engine that Mercedes-Benz offered in these cars. More importantly, it was built by Porsche. This has become a famous story, but in the early 90s, Porsche was hurting for money. Mercedes-Benz found a partner to make their big engine 500E in Porsche. They built this car in a little building in their factory grounds in Stuttgart, the same building where they had been making the 959 only a couple years earlier, the Porsche built 500E. So this is a special car in its own right, even before the AMG upgrades. But the AMG upgrades in this car make it far more special than just a standard 500E. So under the hood you have the same M119 V8 that went into the 500E, but it's been, well, let's just say improved. In fact, it's been enlarged from 5 liters in the 500E to 6 liters in the E60 AMG. Now, there's AMG stuff all over the engine bay. You can see the engine cover has AMG on it printed on both sides, and you have these decals that say AMG. You can see a pair of them right here on the engine itself, and then another set of these AMG decals up front to really drive home the AMG point. In fact, these decals specifically list the power output, and this translates 280 kilowatts to about 375 horsepower, which was a 60 horsepower boost over a standard 500E. That made this a tremendously powerful sedan at the time. 375 horses. Even the V12 powered Mercedes S600 only had 390 horsepower at the time. So this thing was a serious car, especially for a sedan in the early 90s, before sedans really got all that fast. But the really crucial thing about this car, the way you can really tell that it's an original AMG car and that all this stuff wasn't added later and modified, comes when you decode the VIN. Do that and you will see the 957 production code attached to this VIN. That code was a special prep code for AMG cars. What would happen is Mercedes-Benz would build these cars to a standard where they were ready for AMG to come in and do their thing. They weren't built completely, they were turned over to AMG late in the production process so they could make their upgrades. And that 957 production code is coveted by enthusiasts today, showing that it was a real pre-merger AMG car done by AMG when the car was new, not modified or added later. Now, you might be surprised to hear that Mercedes-Benz had a production code for AMG preparation before they actually owned AMG. And indeed, it is unusual. Mercedes didn't take control of AMG till 1999, years after this car was built, but they had a pretty cozy relationship relationship. A working partnership began in the late 80s or early 90s, to the point where Mercedes actually sold AMG accessories in some of their dealerships. Even though they didn't own the company, they were doing stuff together, and that 957 production code is one example. But anyway, that's some of the AMG story with this car. Let's talk about the rest of the quirks and features, and the W124 E-Class gives us oh so many. Starting with some of the 500e upgrades. Like I mentioned, Porsche built these. They were a little different from the standard E-Class, not just from a power and engine perspective, but the bodies. They had flared fenders. It was subtle, but you can see they're flared out a little wider, a little more muscular than a standard E-Class at the time. There was also a more aggressive front end design that gave this car just a little bit of a sportier look on the road. Now, from an exterior perspective, those were all the changes that Mercedes-Benz had made to the 500e, but AMG took things a little further. You can see this car has these wheels, these deeply period correct AMG wheels that just scream late 80s, early 90s AMG. All of the AMG cars in this era had these wheels. They very much look, well, right for the time period, let's say that, and they were more aggressive and more exciting than standard Mercedes-Benz wheels. Now, aside from enlarging the engine to give this car more power and sticking these wheels on here, AMG would have also tuned this car's suspension to make it sportier, more aggressive. Of course, we can't see that. They also would have put on an exhaust in the period. Now, this car no longer has its AMG exhaust. Instead, it has a different aftermarket exhaust on there. The AMG exhaust didn't hold up too well over time, so it's not surprising to see this one has been replaced. And even though it's not the factory AMG exhaust, it still sounds pretty good. Take a listen. Yeah, you don't expect to hear that sound coming from the relatively subdued, restrained W124 E-Class. Now, as for other exterior quirks and features on this car, a couple of my very favorite ones. The exterior rearview mirrors are different sizes. You can see the driver's side is sort of horizontally oriented and the passenger side is vertically oriented. Mercedes-Benz did this intentionally to give you two different fields of vision, and it was supposed to benefit you in the driver's seat, not give you as much blind spot, but it was always a strange quirk of the E-Class from this era. The other interesting exterior item in this car is the windshield wiper, and I say wiper singular because that's what it has. The giant mono wiper, which has this unusual path across the windshield. Strange, but that's all the W124 cars were. Mercedes-Benz had figured out a better solution than your normal boring two wipers in your cars. Interestingly though, this car had more wipers, but they were on the headlights. You can see the lights have individual wipers on them, which actually a few other cars had in the early 90s. Volvo did this too, and they were on this E-Class. So only one wiper for the windshield, but two for the headlights. But anyway, next up we climb inside the E60 AMG, and in here you're surprisingly not greeted by very many AMG upgrades. You see, back in the day, AMG didn't focus on interior changes and headrests and floor mats. They were all about power, speed, and exterior cosmetic upgrades. In here there's only a few changes from a standard 500e. One is the gauge cluster. You can see AMG on the speedometer, and of course the speedometer goes higher than it would in a standard E-Class on account of this being faster. You also have an upgraded steering wheel. It's a standard Mercedes-Benz wheel from this period in the center, but on the outside it's grippier, thicker, feels more aggressive, more sports car. I actually love how it looks and how it feels. I wish Mercedes-Benz had put this wheel in more of their cars at the time, but it was an AMG upgrade. Same deal with the pedals. You have AMG pedals, as you can see. That was a nice cosmetic touch compared to a standard 500e E500, but otherwise there really wasn't that much AMG in this interior. Again, it just wasn't their area of focus. They were all about speed. But despite the fact that there aren't that many AMG upgrades in here, this is still a standard W124 E-Class interior, which means it is loaded with bizarre quirks and features. Let's start with the climate controls, where adjusting the temperature is done on these wheels of color, blue for cold air, white was in the middle, and then red for warm air, and that's how you change the temperature instead of the dials or the buttons that we are more accustomed to in most normal vehicles. Also unusual in this vicinity, you have a row of switches here, one of which shows a powdered sugar donut. As you can clearly see, that is actually the winter tire mode. It's a tire with snow chains on it. And if you're going to put snow chains on your tires, I guess you would press that button so the car would know and it would respond accordingly. Also interesting in this area, no glove box in this car. A lot of Mercedes-Benz models from this era didn't have one. So instead you had a center console with this roll top wood lid, and then it would lock. So if you wanted to stick stuff in there, you did have a locking storage compartment, but it wasn't in the usual glove box area. That's because these cars had an airbag, as you can see. It was somewhat forward thinking to have dual airbags on a car in the early 1990s, but a lot of Mercedes-Benz models did. The drawback was you lost your glove box. Next up, another interesting W124 interior quirk. Going back to that center row of switches, you can see one marked temp. So here's the deal with that. Go into the gauge cluster and there's this little screen at the bottom center that shows some numbers. If you press the temp switch, a green light turns on and then it displays the exterior temperature in Celsius, as you can see. If you press the temp switch in the other direction, an orange light turns on and then it displays a vastly negative number. I have no idea what this second number is. I have looked everywhere, I've Googled, I've asked the cultivated collector, the car seller, we can't figure out what this is, but it's showing some number. You press temp again and it switches back to the exterior temperature. Our thinking is maybe that was a digital engine temperature gauge that isn't currently working, but you do have an engine temperature gauge on the actual gauge cluster, so it would have been a weird redundancy. Regardless, you have this little screen down here, green and orange lights to show you exterior temperature and something. By the way, I actually owned a 1993 500e, pretty much this exact same car without the cool AMG stuff, and it didn't have that little screen there. So I really am at a loss to describe exactly what that does. But anyway, on to more quirks. One is for the gear selector area. You can see there's a little switch with an E above that. If you push the switch up, it reveals a little S. Those were for economy mode and sport mode in your shifter when you were driving, and you only had those two choices. There was no normal. You were either economy or sport. And speaking of little switches that reveal stuff, you have your power window switches here in the center console area. Pretty standard, straightforward, arranged like you'd expect. There's also a little switch. If you move that switch to the right, it reveals a child. So you have child mode or regular mode. Now, of course, what this actually did was, if it was in child mode, it would lock out the rear controls from being able to roll up or down the windows in case you didn't want your children to have that level of fun. But it's odd to see that switch just show a little kid on it. And speaking of weird switches in this car, I got you another one. On the door, you have the seat controls, which is fairly standard for Mercedes-Benz. You got the seat bottom, the seat back, but there's another control in here. This one is for the headrest. This car has power-operated headrests. And if you push this control up or down, the headrest will move corresponding to your push. So it goes up or down automatically, which is a nice luxury touch in the E60. Next up, another wonderful W124 quirk. If you start the car but don't put on your seatbelt, there is a warning light to remind you, but it's not in the gauge cluster. Instead, it's on the ceiling above the rear view mirror, and it's rather large, unusually so, blinking at you, reminding you to put on your seatbelt. And speaking of this area, in this car, you can drop the sun visors, like in most cars, to reduce the sun's glare, driver or passenger side, but there's also a third sun visor located here in the middle. You put this down and it makes sure that no sunlight comes through the little gap between the rear view mirror and the ceiling. That little slot there, if you've ever been annoyed that some sun still comes through even with the visors down, well, in this car, it doesn't. Another good example of Mercedes-Benz attention to detail and quality in this era. And by the way, speaking of dropping things down, you have this little button in the center control stack area with a seat and an arrow and a headrest. that will drop the rear seat headrest. Push that, and you can see they fall down automatically. So if you don't have rear passengers and you want to maximize your rear visibility, you can just drop the headrest. The only problem is you can't put them back up with that button. If somebody gets into the back seat, they'll have to manually put the rear headrest back in place in order for maximum head protection. But anyway, speaking of the back seat in the E60 AMG, let's move back here where there are some interesting quirks, the biggest of which is, well, it's not really all that big. Sitting back here, I got the front seat moved up and I can get my knees and legs in, but it's tight. And again, you got to move the front seat up, and headroom isn't exactly better. My head is kind of pushing up against the headliner. It's just not huge, but such was the standard of its day. A lot of mid-sized sedans in the late 80s and early 90s had kind of tight back seats for taller adults. They were meant to ride in the front. Now, the other interesting thing about the 500e and thus this E60 is there's only 2 back seats. Most people don't realize this. The standard E-Class had a 3-person bench like most midsize sedans, but the 500e only had 2 seats in back, 2 individual seats. And they are pretty heavily bolstered. These obviously aren't Porsche Sport bucket seats. By modern standards, they're not all that bolstered, but for back in the day in a sedan, these were some bolstered seats in case you were going around fast corners, since this was a fast car. Now, as you can see, between the seats, in place of the middle seat, you have this wood panel here. This is actually a roll top for a storage compartment. Roll it back, and then you have a little extra storage in the back, and of course it looks nice. And at the front of this central area, you have an ashtray, because it wouldn't be a German car from the 90s, or the 80s, or the 70s, or the 2000s, frankly, if it didn't have a rear seat ashtray. They all had that at the time. Now, the other thing you had in the center between the 2 individual seats back here is an armrest. It pulled out from the seat backrest area. You could pull it down, stick it in place, and then you could add to your rear seat comfort in your E60 AMG. Also worth pointing out, another nice touch back here is reading lights. You had individual reading lights that you could turn on with the push of a button, as you can see, and they were angled into the rear passenger's laps. So if they were actually reading a book or a newspaper, they could turn those on and it would illuminate what they were reading, and they could read easier. Now, other interesting quirks in the back come on the rear shelf. You had a first aid kit in this car, and it was mounted here under this panel in this compartment on the rear shelf. So if you needed to do some first aid while you were on the move, you had access to it. It wasn't stuck in the trunk like so many other cars. Also in this rear area, you had a sunshade that was built into the rear window, although unfortunately, it can only be controlled by the front seat occupants. This button here controlled the sunshade, and they could put it up or down. But if you were sitting in the back, you couldn't control it yourself. You simply had to ask the front seat people nicely, could you put up my sunshade? And then maybe if you were lucky, they would do it. And finally, we move around back in the E60 AMG to the trunk, which, despite the quirkiness of the rest of this car, is actually fairly normal. You push this little trunk popper to open it up, lift up the trunk, and then you can see just a regular cargo storage area. Actually, a fairly large one. That was always a nice benefit of the W124 E-Class, good trunk space, which was obviously important to mid-size Mercedes-Benz sedan buyers of the 80s and 90s. But other than that, nothing too unusual in here, except for the warning triangle mounted on the inside of the trunk lid. This is fairly standard in a lot of countries. In fact, in many countries, it's legally mandated, but not here in America. So it's always cool to see this factory warning triangle. It makes the car feel more authentically imported, which of course this one actually was, since it wasn't sold new in the States. But otherwise, just a regular cargo area. All right, driving the E60 AMG. Now, I have a sacrilegious confession to make, which is I owned a 1993 500e, the Porsche-built Mercedes-Benz, and I didn't really like it. I always thought it was just a little too, well, to be honest, slow. It just didn't feel all that fast. I owned it at the same time as a 2001 E55 AMG, and that car just always felt faster and better. And I always thought the W124 chassis is pretty cool. It feels like tight and high quality, and yet the 500e was never what I was looking for. This car, however, is a different situation. Instantly driving this car, I am shocked by two things. Number one, how much more lively it feels to drive in terms of steering and handling. And number two, how much quicker it is. I'm gonna hit first on the steering and handling because that's my biggest surprise. The acceleration, I'm not all that surprised. I knew it was gonna be fast. It has a lot more power and a bigger engine and this big exhaust, and you knew it was gonna have some muscle to it. The steering and handling is really surprising to me. This car feels so much more alive than my 500e did. The 500e, it was built by Porsche and it had this extra power, but it always had this sort of solid, like old school feel to it. It was nice, but it wasn't a performance car. This feels different. This feels more like peppy and potent and ready to have some fun. I'm stunned by just how much more sprightly it feels to drive. It doesn't feel like the big stoic Mercedes-Benz sedan that my 500e did. I'm actually astonished by the handling. Now, I don't want to say that it's like really precise and sports car quick because it isn't, but it feels fun in a way the 500e absolutely did not. And speaking of that acceleration, I'm going to stomp on it. Oh, 3,000, it's fast. I mean, this car feels so much faster than a 500e, and the sound is excellent. 4,000, wow. Oh, wow. That is some serious acceleration above 3,000 RPM or so. I can't believe how much better of a total overall package of car this is than the 500e. It feels way faster than another 60 horsepower would suggest, and the steering is just so much, it's just more fun. It feels so much more lively. It's like Mercedes-Benz took the W124 E-Class and made a fast sedan, but it was kind of all engine. It was all power up front. AMG took this car and made it like a actual fun performance sedan. And the thing that's cool about that is this car was in the days where those weren't really being made. The M5s and the high performance Audis were just starting to kind of hit the market and just starting to become like a thing. And so making like a lively, fun car out of a mid-sized stoic sedan wasn't really on anyone's mind, but AMG knew what to do. Oh, it's so quick. The really impressive part though, you drop the accelerator. The really impressive part is high in the rev range because this car is let down by its automatic transmission. 4-speed auto with a torque converter, not really tuned for performance. And so the car doesn't have a lot of gears to choose from when you want to accelerate, so you basically just have to wait until it really gets high in the rev range, and that's when it's more fun. But you can enjoy the steering and handling at any time. I can't believe that AMG made the W124 feel like light on its feet. It was always such a heavy feeling, solid car. I mean, it had great benefits. The solidity, the reliability, everybody knows it was like a bank vault. That's what everybody says about the W124. But this car makes it actually seem like fun. Who knew? I am surprisingly smitten with this car. You get all the benefits of a W124, this high quality, solid interior, nothing rattles, even though this car has 230,000 kilometers on it. It was so well built. It was this fantastic Mercedes-Benz era where everything was just wonderfully built with high quality stuff. So you get that, you get the sort of understated styling. Obviously the wheels take things up a notch, but generally speaking, it's pretty understated. And yet you actually get like a fun, thrilling car. It feels a lot more modern than the 500e or other W124 cars because it feels faster and it handles better. It feels like kind of the next generation of E55, to be honest. It's impressive. I'm like surprisingly impressed with how much I like this car. It makes good sounds, it looks cool. This feels like a fun car with that big 6-liter V8 under the hood. But it isn't just about, speed and power. It's also just more fun to drive. And so that's the Mercedes-Benz E60 AMG. This is a truly special car. Any 500e is special, and any pre-merger AMG car is special, and combining the two is amazing. I'm thrilled I had a chance to review this car, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the E60 a DougScore. And the DougScore is here. The E60 AMG gets a 55 out of 100, which places it here against other relevant cars from this era. Actually, way ahead of most, including the standard 500e. I was really impressed with this car. It has all the nice benefits of a 500e, like good build quality and practicality, but it adds a far more enjoyable driving experience and some cool styling cues, plus the cachet of a pre-merger AMG car. This may just be the coolest W124, and it's surprising to me to see just what this chassis is capable of with some good upgrading.